All right, let's see if we can get this to work. Um, Gotta find a link and then I will share this and then get started. Oops. All right. Sorry, this is not something I do on a normal basis. In fact, I've never live streamed before and had to learn what to click to do so. So bear with me. Also, I'm still on like an adrenaline rush from the courthouse. It was kind of an insane day, which I will get into shortly. All right. The downside of having 80 social media platforms is trying to post to all of them. Okay. Hello. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know people will join because I literally just posted the link. Let me know if you can't hear me okay. I've got my mic. I have my webcam. This should hopefully work. Hopefully the internet in here is okay enough for me to stream. If I cut out, please just give me a yell. Okay. So I got here, just a little recap. I got here yesterday night. I flew in after booking a ticket yesterday morning. I had actually taken a little bit of a bet that I was beginning to think he would testify beginning last week. And I did some sort of calculations based on what I knew at the time, and I bought a refundable plane ticket to be here next Monday and Tuesday, thinking that if he was likely to testify, it would be the last testimony in the defense and therefore probably wouldn't happen until Monday because they were expecting the defense to begin maybe midway through Thursday. Well, became very clear yesterday that that was not an accurate guess and that he was going to testify beginning today. So I booked a plane ticket, got here last night, was at the courthouse this morning. I did not join the line of people who lined up in front of the courthouse starting at like 3 in the morning. So the way that it works is that there's 20, I think maybe 20, 21, 26, some number like that, seats in the courthouse that are just like a free for all. There's no press passes, nothing like that. Any random person can show up and try to get in. But for a trial like this, you have to be first in line. And I knew it was going to be insane. So I did not try to do that, largely because I was expecting that it would just be the defense case today and that I think the cross-examination will be the interesting part. But I'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, I showed up at 8, got into the overflow room. And so the way that that works is there's like a TV and well, there's sort of like it's in like it's in a courtroom, like an unused courtroom. And so there's the jury box that has like 10 seats in it. And each of those seats has its own TV stream. For the rest of us hoi polloi, we go and sit in just like these pews. That's really all I can call them, is like a pew. And there's one TV, and you can see there's like a close up on the whoever's testifying, and then there's sort of an aerial view of the courtroom. And you can, if I was closer to it, and the streams are tiny. It's on this like TV probably as big as the one behind me, but half of the TV is left blank for any exhibits. And then the other two streams are side by side. So they're really small, but you can hear very well. And so you can see from like an aerial view, the defense team, the prosecution team. Sam Bankman-Fried is like this big when he's sitting with his defense, that is. And then like maybe a row or so behind them, but you can't see the jury. You can't see the judge even. And then there's like the little stand lectern where they stand to ask questions and stuff like that. So I was there. It was great. I will talk a little bit about who else was there because I thought that was fascinating. Who all showed up to watch this trial. It was a really interesting mix of people. I genuinely like would love to just sit down and talk to each person who's there watching the trial for like 30 minutes apiece because it's very interesting. There's the journalists, obviously, from traditional publications. I got to meet this lovely woman today who is from The Economist. I saw some Wall Street Journal people there. There was someone from New York Magazine who I saw. That's what comes to mind immediately. And then there's all the crypto publications. So CoinDesk has like a bunch of people there. Nick Day is there, who I think is one of the best people covering this trial, and his whole team of like Danny and all those folks are doing wonderful work. I don't think Nick has slept in maybe 3 or 4 weeks. Someone help that poor man. But he's doing admirable work. I ran into someone from Decrypt. I like Decrypt quite a lot. There was someone from, what else? CoinGape I met. No, not CoinGape. That's the one that I think has the funny name. Coinage. I think that's what it was. Anyway, all those folks were there. I met some Twitter people. There are people who were like, "Oh, what publication are you from?" And they're like, Twitter." And that was fun. And then there was sort of the other side of things, which was like not the journalists, but it was people who were just there out of like public interest. And those people were a little hard to pin down. Like some of them I was like, okay, but what's your interest? Why are you really here? Were you friends with Bankman-Fried? Did you work for him? Like, did he rip you off? What was that? So anyway, I didn't necessarily get a read on that. There was at least one person who, no, there were at least 2 people who were like big crypto folks. There was some guy wearing a hat that said XRP is not a security. That's XRP being Ripple. That's right? I might be getting that confused. Okay, yeah, it's Ripple. I always get it confused with Stellar, which is the other one that has the weird ticker. Anyway, so like total crypto head. Michael Lewis was there. He was in the same overflow room with me, but his assistant had like saved him a seat and he came in late. She actually came up to me and she's like, "Are you Molly?" And I was like, "Yes." And she's like, "I'm Michael Lewis's assistant. We talked when we were scheduling your appearance on his podcast." And I was like, "Oh, cool." And she's like, "He's going to be here later." And I was like, "Great." I don't know if he's read the review that I did of his book, so that might be an awkward moment. But I would love to ask him what he thinks of the trial. I know he's been doing a podcast about it, but I haven't had a minute to actually listen to what he's been saying. So I don't know if he still thinks that like Sam's innocent, the money's all there or whatever, or if he has changed his tune on that. I'm not sure. Jacob Silverman was there. Love Jacob Silverman. I think Ben McKenzie was maybe around, but I didn't run into him. I hope to. Yeah, I think that's kind of... Oh, and there was a couple lawyers there. There was someone who's from a company that does bankruptcy law, although I don't think she's actually working on any of the crypto bankruptcies, but she was there to just sort of get a vibe, which was cool. So yeah, that's, I think, one of the more interesting things is just like all the people who show up who are just there because they think it's interesting, and even like will wait in line and stuff. So now onto the actual trial today. So I didn't have my phone, my laptop, anything like that. You go into the courtroom and they take all your electronics away because they don't want you to take pictures or record or live stream or do all the crazy shit that I'm sure people would do if they were allowed to have phones. So that was gone, but I had my notebook. I took so many notes today. My hand hurts. I don't usually write anymore because I have a computer. I took this many notes today. I may have to go and start writing on the backs of pages tomorrow if I run out, but we'll get to that bridge when we cross it. The day started this morning, 9:30. It started off with kind of a funny note where a juror was ill, like barfing, and the defense had already been like, yeah, it's fine to excuse him. The government hadn't responded, but the judge wanted to excuse him anyway. And so he went ahead and just said, "You're excused," assuming that the government would be fine with it later, which they were, except then the juror said he didn't want to leave. And so it turned out that like he wanted to be involved in the trial so badly that he wanted to stay even though he was barfing. The weird thing is that he was an alternate juror, so it's not even like he was like in line to be one of the people delivering a verdict, unless like he was like fourth in line. So like 4 people would have to drop out before this guy would be actually deliberating with the rest of the jury. Anyway, the judge excused him anyway. He was like, I don't know if you're contagious. I don't want you getting everyone sick. I think there's like someone else on the jury who's maybe vulnerable or something. And so he was like, please just go home. So that was kind of a funny start to the day, because if I was barfing, the last place I would want to be is sitting in a juror box all day, stuck watching people talk about financial records. But more power to that devoted civil servant. Okay, so today was the end of the prosecution's testimony. So they were wrapping things up. They had one witness left. It was a person named Agent Marc Troiano, who was an FBI agent. He was on the Corporate Securities Commodities Fraud Squad, which really rolls off the tongue. I like Fraud Squad. I think that's great. And he basically showed up to testify to the not even really the authenticity of the signal chats, but sort of the quantity of signal chats. So very shortly after FTX collapsed in November of 2022. Things started to go really south, like November 8th, 9th, somewhere around there. And then I think it was the 11th that they technically filed for bankruptcy. Well, by November 16th, the FBI had recovered Carolyn Ellison's laptop. I think I remember reading or somewhere that they like raided her parents' house, which is where she was staying at the time with her boyfriend. Took all of her devices, I think they even took like her boyfriend's computer, which is just kind of rude, but I get it. Sorry, it was Carolyn Ellison's cell phone, not her laptop. But they also, on the 17th, took Gary Wong's laptop. And that was from where they got all these signal chats. So like there's this whole thing where FTX was having all of their signal chats were on auto delete. And with Signal, the whole thing is they're end-to-end encrypted, which means that Signal does not actually have like a copy of your messages that you can just like subpoena Signal and they'll turn it over to the FBI. Like you have to get it from one of the people on an end of the chat, and it has to be pretty quick because otherwise these week-long deletion periods will kick in. So they snagged these laptops, scraped all the Signal data off of there. The agent described it as quite voluminous, which to be clear, there were 325 Signal groups that had Sam Bankman-Fried in them. 288 of those had auto delete turned on. And Sam Bankman-Fried, later in the day, I'll get to his testimony, he testified that he just had a setting in Signal where like any new chat would automatically be set to auto delete in a week. So it's not like he was necessarily setting 288 times, but still, that's a lot of chats. So they basically, what they wanted to show was like this kind of high level view of these bajillion Signal chats. I think to try to say that like, look, he was being so cagey by having all of these set to auto delete. And so they showed this chart of like the name of the Signal chat, the participants in it, and then the auto delete settings and like who set them and when, and if they were changed, that would show up too. And so all of these chats were in the time period of like 2020 to 2022. The agent was not testifying about the contents of them. I don't think he actually really read them, but he was just, compiling these lists of like the name and the date and, talking about their authenticity. Cross-examination was meh. I mean, this is the first time I've actually seen them in person cross-examining. I've been this is the first day I'm in person at the trial. For those of you who've not been following my reporting, which I will plug right now, newsletter.mollywhite.net. Please subscribe. It's free. You don't have to pay to read anything, but if you do pay, I will be extra grateful. And you will help pay me back for this very expensive last-minute flight and hotel room. So the prosecution cross-examination has looked pretty rough on paper. I've been reading the transcripts every night. It doesn't look like they'll just go down these sort of tangents where they'll often repeat a part of what the direct questioning covered, which the judge has gotten quite annoyed about. They'll start asking questions. The prosecution will object, and then the judge will sustain the objection. And so they get sort of cut off where they were trying to go. Or even if that doesn't happen, they'll just sort of get somewhere or seem like they're about to get somewhere and then just change course. And you're like, what was that even about? And that was kind of the vibe I got from the cross-examination of this FBI guy. I mean, like, to be fair, what do you even ask this guy? You know, he's like an FBI agent who was reading lists of signal chats. He wasn't talking about anything that was said in those signal chats. He wasn't saying anything about like what the motivations were for the auto delete or anything like that. But they gave it their best shot, I guess, and tried to imply that the FBI agent had been given the document that had all the signal chats in the chart and stuff, and that like maybe the prosecution wanted him to exclude certain groups so it looked worse than it was or whatever. And the guy was like, they did not ask me to exclude any groups. And he said that like the draft document was provided to him by the prosecution, but he reviewed it and made changes to it freely, you know, and that they weren't like trying to control it and stuff like that. So I didn't think that was terribly that didn't really go anywhere. And then there was an objection, a sidebar, and ultimately that whole question they had stricken from the record. I think that so when I read the transcripts, the court reporter hears the sidebars and I get to see what was discussed in the sidebar, but you can't hear that when you're there in person, at least not from the overflow room. So I will later find out what they actually said during that sidebar. For right now, I don't know. Okay, so there was more questions about the chart, and they ended up getting into that sort of problem that they've gotten into before, where they are asking the questions of this guy who's there to testify, and he's just kind of reading what's in front of him on the chart. And eventually the judge is like, it's a chart. He literally said, it's a chart. You can just look at it. At some point he said, this is not an exam for new eyeglasses. Like he was repeatedly trying to get them to just move along. Like the chart says what it says. He eventually told them, you know, you will have a closing argument and you can make any inferences you want from this chart, but now is not the time to try to make juries, you know, the jury think something specific about this chart. And so they eventually gave up. I'm very proud of this. So for any of you who have been following some of the other coverage of this trial, one thing I really, really love is that Nick Day at CoinDesk has been doing his own little courtroom sketches where he'll like draw someone on the defense, and they're just these little line drawings on like a yellow legal pad. They're really cute, and they've started to go around on Twitter, or they'll get included in some of these some of the CoinDesk articles. Well, I was in the same overflow room as Nick, and so I did my own little drawing of Nick. I don't know if he was actually doing a drawing at this point or if he was just taking notes, but that's my artwork. And so now we have a drawing of Nick doing a drawing of the courtroom, or maybe it was just taking notes like a normal person. Okay, so at that point, the government rested. That was 10:10 a.m. So really quick. I mean, they started at 9:30. We were done by 10:10. That was the point at which the judge starts to say, okay, so is the defense going to bring a case? Because I wrote about this a little bit earlier, but the defense is not obligated to bring a case. They can say the government, you know, it is in their hands. It is their obligation to prove that our client is guilty. If we don't think that they've made that case, we can just say, you know, they didn't make their case and not put on their own case. That would be wild, I think, if that happened in this case, because it would be tantamount to just giving up. I think everyone sort of agrees that the prosecution has had a strong case so far, and so that would just be bananas. So first, there was this whole thing where the defense said, Your Honor, we move for a judgment to acquit. We believe the evidence is insufficient to sustain the charges. And they went into some more detail around there was like they didn't prove something about materiality with counts 3 and 4 and 5, I think. Insufficient evidence for 1 and 2. Anyway, again, that would have been wild. The prosecution opposed that. Obviously, the motion was denied. So this is my first trial I've ever reported on. I think that was maybe that's just what they do at that point. I don't think that was anything particularly like, whoa, they tried to get him acquitted right then. Like, but I don't know. Someone more experienced with court reporting could certainly say if I'm wrong there. So at that point, the defense said, we're going to bring a case. We have 3 witnesses, Krystal Rolle, Joseph Pimbley, and then Sam Bankman-Fried. So we started out, they estimated it was going to be 15 or 20 minutes for Krystal Rolle, 15 or 20 minutes for Joseph Pimbley, and then Sam Bankman-Fried. They were pretty accurate in their estimate with Krystal Rolle. They were not accurate with Joseph Pimbley, who was verbose. And then ultimately, they didn't try to estimate how long SBF was going to take. I will get back to the whole thing around Sam Bankman-Fried and why he was testifying without the jury present, but I'm going to cover the defense witnesses first, and this should be pretty quick because they were not super long. One of them was quite wordy, but So the first witness was Krystal Rolle. She is an attorney from the Bahamas who was retained by Sam Bankman-Fried. And sorry if I'm looking down, I'm literally reading my notes right here. I guess I could hold it right here and do this, but I don't think it's going to work well. She was retained by Sam Bankman-Fried on November 12th, which was the day after FTX US declared bankruptcy, but there were also in the Bahamas these separate liquidation proceedings that were going on. And I don't know if any of you remember from back then, but there was this whole push and pull between who had jurisdiction over the bankruptcy. Was it going to be in the Bahamas? Was it going to be in the US? All that. So this is like a separate thing that was going on. And so Bankman-Fried retained Krystal Rolle, who is this attorney. I loved her. I thought she was great. She was just very professional on the stand, but occasionally it was kind of funny. And there's this whole thing about her last name. So her last name is Rolle, Rolle. Weirdly enough, well, maybe not so weird, the executive director of the Bahamian, I'm learning today that it's actually Bahamian, I think, instead of Bahamian, which shows what I know. I'm one of those people who's read a lot more words than I've heard said out loud, so bear with me. Anyway, the Bahamian Securities Commission executive director is named Christina Rolle. And so there was this are you guys related? Turns out Rolle is the most common last name in the Bahamas. And so she shares a last name with her. And actually, I think there was a third person who came up during today's testimony who has that same name too. No relation. First, before they started, there was this sidebar around admissibility of some redacted documents. That turned out to be kind of a nothing burger, so I'm not going to go into it and waste time. Christina Rolle was retained by Bankman-Fried on the morning of the 12th, which was the day after the U.S. bankruptcy, and it was also the day that I don't know if it was the day that he received the notice, but it was the day that he was supposed to meet with the Bahamian Securities Commission about what all went down. And so he retained this attorney as a personal attorney. She wasn't working for FTX. She wasn't representing FTX. She was there to represent Bankman-Fried. And there was this meeting. It was mandatory because liquidation proceedings had begun on FTX Digital Markets, which was the Bahamian entity of FTX. And so they described who was at the meeting. It was basically the SCB director and some of her staff. There was one of the provisional liquidators and some assistants maybe. And then it was Sam Bankman-Fried, Joe Bankman, his father, and this new attorney, Krystal Rolle. Gary Wang, was in the building, but not at the meeting. I think he had maybe been called for a separate meeting. I don't know what happened, but anyway, he was there, but not there. They had a 3-hour-long interview. They asked him some questions, and then all of them, without Joe Bankman for some reason, went back to the FTX offices, basically to sign the properties over to the SCB, which is the abbreviation for the Bahamian Securities Commission. And this order was read to them basically from the SCB saying, you need to transfer all digital assets that are sort of under the purview of FTX Digital Markets, to these wallets that have been set up by the Securities Commission. And so this was this whole big thing back when the bankruptcies first started, where there were like accusations flying between the US and the Bahamas. Now I'm really screwing things up. Where like, was it really could they even do that? I think they even denied ordering them to do that for a while, but eventually I think admitted that they had ordered this. This was also around the time that a bunch of money had just been stolen, because there was a hack on November 11th of all this money from FTX. And so people were like, oh my God, is this being stolen? It was like this panicky time. But basically, they were in the offices until like 2 a.m. that night. Gary Wang mostly was doing these transfers to move the assets over to the control of the Bahamas. They also got an order from the Supreme Court. And so I think they were I think the defense was basically trying to say that like he wasn't trying to move the assets outside of the US jurisdiction, because that's something that has sort of been thrown around a little bit, although I don't think there's actually a charge related to that. Maybe there is. But they're basically putting up this attorney who's saying that if he didn't comply with his court order from the Bahamas Supreme Court, he would be held in contempt of court, potentially imprisoned. And so, that's, I think, why she was brought there. I can see the chat. I think that regarding the inside job, it's still really hard to say. There were some rumblings around the time of the hack that it may have been, I think even Sam Bankman-Fried was like, the only people who had this kind of knowledge were insiders or something like that. But there's really not that much that's been uncovered, I think, around that hack, at least not publicly. I know the bankruptcy estate is working to try to recover that money, but so far, I think no real luck in that department. Okay. So yeah, Rolle testified. It was basically just about what happened in that meeting. She's an attorney, so they weren't covering any of the advice that she was giving to Bankman-Fried during that period of time. It was really just like, this is what happened in the meeting, and then this is what happened after the meeting in the offices. There was this really funny moment during cross-examination. So every time the prosecution has brought a witness, the defense does this thing during cross-examination that was like, have you met with prosecutors before before giving this testimony? Did they prepare you? How many times did you meet with them? Is it correct that you were meeting with them in this date and this date and this date, to try to say that like you've had all these meetings with these prosecutors, really implying that the prosecution was coaching them to say whatever they say on the stand. Well, so the first witness that the defense puts up, the first thing the cross-examiner goes, did you meet with the defense before giving this testimony? How many times did you meet with the defense before giving this testimony? There's nothing irregular, is there, about meeting in advance of giving testimony? Like, very obviously trying to make those same arguments, not because they're trying to imply that this lovely woman did anything wrong or was, lying because the defense wanted her to, but just to say that, like, this is standard operating procedure when you are bringing a witness to testify for your side of the case. Like, please don't, hold anything against them for that. So I thought that was a nice touch. I hope it went over well with the jurors. I don't know. And then they sort of talked a little bit about, like, this woman was providing legal advice to Sam Bankman-Fried at the time of basically November 12th onward. She was not involved with FTX. She was not giving him advice about what to do with customer funds or whether it was okay to lend them out or spend them on real estate or anything like that. She didn't even really know what FTX was before this whole thing. So they were basically just trying to say that, like, okay, she can talk about what happened on this day and maybe a couple days later, but doesn't have a whole lot to say about the actual crimes that were allegedly committed. So that finished up Krystal Rolle. She was done by 11:10. Cross-examination took 5 minutes. It was, like, super efficient, which I've heard is kind of the theme throughout. From the testimony, just reading the transcripts transcripts, not testimony. It's hard to get a sense of time because they're not really time-stamped, so you can see when people come and go for breaks and stuff, and you can kind of infer when lunch was, but, it's hard to get a sense of timing, but I get the sense that, like, the defense tends to be pretty meandering and will take a while. They'll, like, pause to check their notes and stuff like that, whereas the prosecution is just like bam, 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 like, no shuffling of papers, just, like, straight to the point, and that's definitely what I noticed today, especially with Danielle Sassoon, who is as far as I can tell, like, the top prosecutor that they've got. You know, they're not bringing out the second string here. This is, like, the big guns, and she seemed very effective to me as a complete novice to trials. Okay, after that, we had Mr. Joseph Pimbley. I think he's actually Dr. Joseph Pimbley because he does have a PhD. I thought he seemed like a weird choice. He was this sort of older gentleman who he has 3 degrees, all from Rensselaer. No, Rensselaer. One of the R's. I get them confused. There's like there's like Rochester Polytechnic. Anyway, totally beside the point. 3 physics degrees, bachelor's, master's, PhD. Then he worked for a semiconductor company as like an expert in semiconductors. So it's like, okay, that's kind of weird. Then he was an assistant math professor at his alma mater. Okay. And then eventually he does quantitative finance at Citibank. Then he was working at a place called ACA Capital. So I talked about this with some of the journalists who were in the room with me, because when he said this, I was like looking around to see if other people reacted the way that I did, and I tried to figure out from the people so there were some journalists who had like camped out and were in the courtroom, and I was like, did the jury react to this? And they were saying that like the jury today was kind of muted. There wasn't a whole lot of reaction to anything. So hard to say if this landed with the jury, but he was talking about his experience at ACA Capital, and he was saying that he was a portfolio manager for CDOs, like collateralized debt obligations, or whatever that is, whatever that acronym means. He was doing like risk analysis for CDOs, which is like a weird background for someone testifying in a case that has been sort of likened to some of the major financial collapses, right? Like, I thought that was bizarre. Anyway, that's just kind of like a fun little note, but I was like, anyway, he basically testified to say that, yeah, he's like a math guy, but he's also written a lot of code. He knows SQL. He can read Python. He did say something weird, which is that like only 1 or 2 of his clients in the last 10 years have really wanted him to work on databases, which seems like a little discrediting if you're testifying about databases, but what do I know? Yes, he's a witness for the defense. And I was reading the sorry, my brain is so fried. He was the thing that he puts up, the like disclosures or something like that in front of just to allow him to testify. And I was like, why is this guy being brought up? I think he's being brought up largely in response to the prosecution's witness, who everyone keeps comparing to Santa Claus because he looks kind of like Santa Claus. Professor Easton, I believe his name was, who was the finance professor or the accounting professor who made all those cool little charts about like how much of the funds that were being put into like venture investments and real estate and blah, 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 were like had to have been customer funds. So he was being brought up, I think, to sort of try to rebut that sort of line of testimony, but I didn't think it was very effective. For one, it took forever. They talked about his background until 11:25. They started at 11:10. Okay, so that was only 15 minutes, but oh my God, I thought like people were falling asleep. And he was giving these long explanations of what SQL is, what he means when he's talking about a code layer, what a relational database was. Like, again, I was not in the room with the jury, so I could not see if they were even awake or how they were responding to this whole topic, but it just seemed like way too much detail for the defense or for the jury. Like, these are laymen. I think there's one who has like an investment background. I don't think any of them are like coders or anything like that. And so I'm not sure how much that really landed. But he basically was brought on in August, which seems really recent, to extract data from a snapshot of FTX's AWS database that was taken in November 2022. So it was like snapshot taken basically at the time of the collapse. He said it was 300 tables, about 30 terabytes of data, 9 to 11 million users, and all of their transactions and all that kind of stuff. He also was provided with the FTX code base, which is mostly in Python. He said it was around 25 megs, around 17,000 files. He used the combination of those two things to answer 3 questions from the defense. 1, what was the in-use line of credit by Alameda Research? 2, what was the total balance of all customers, excluding Alameda Research and any FTX entities? And then he grouped that by like the types of coins, like some of the big tokens versus all coins. And then number 3, I am going over this much more quickly than he did. This was extremely meandering. Number 3 was what was number 3? Did they even ever get to number 3? All right, I'll come back to that if I can find it. And so he made these graphs. There were really 3 graphs. One was the in-use Alameda line of credit over time, and this was from October 2021 until November 2022. And it was sort of this line that like started around $1 billion and then like went up and did some stuff and then came back down in June, which would have been around June 2022, which was around or shortly after the Three Arrows Capital collapse, and a bunch of like that's when some of the lenders went under. That was like the first big collapse. And then went up and up and up and then just sort of continued to go up. But capped out at, I don't know, 5 billion or something like that. Something like that. And then they brought out these other 2 diagrams, which were just pie charts showing the total balances on FTX, again, excluding FTX and Alameda entities. And then they basically had 2 parts of the pie chart. There was the customers who had spot margin enabled, spot margin lending enabled, or had engaged in any futures trading ever. And then the other part of the pie chart, which was the smaller part, was the people who had not done that. Now, this is what I thought was really interesting. It was pretty clear to me, just from looking at those documents, from following this case, etc., that the argument that they're trying to make there, I think, is that if we look at the balance that Alameda had, you know, this line of credit that they were drawing down, and then we look at the number or the amount of money that was the balances by all customers who were involved in this margin lending or futures trading, you could argue that all of that line of credit was coming from these customers who had said, it's okay to, I understand that my funds are being used for borrowing and lending. I think that's what they were trying to say, but I cannot emphasize enough the extent to which I am making that inference right now, because it was not made clear at all by the defense team. In fact, I think the people who made the strongest allusion to it was the prosecution on cross-examination, because they were effectively rebutting what I just said, except the defense never came out and said that. Like, they were just showing these charts, and it was like, I guess the jurors were supposed to make that leap, but like they never made that argument. And so maybe they'll come back to it in their closing or something, but like the prosecution has been really good at having this story of like what, they'll ask these questions, but it's very clear like what they're trying to say and the inferences that you were meant to draw from that. And the defense, like, it was just this guy presenting these charts, it's like, and you're supposed to, I guess, just figure it out from that. The other issue was that it did not go well, I think, during cross-examination. He was given this database by the defense team. There's no obviously allegation that they altered the database or anything. I don't think there's any question about the authenticity of the data, but he was asked to just do these very specific projects that they asked him to do with very little additional information. So critically, when he was asked to put together this sort of aggregate idea of Alameda's line of credit that they were drawing down, he did not include the fiat at account, which represented Alameda's debt to FTX, basically the customer funds. And he did not include what's been referred to as our Korean friend. And earlier on in this case, Gary Wong testified, I think it was Gary Wong, who testified at one point that like during the collapse, there was this moment where he was looking up what Alameda's financial position was. And he was like, oh my God, everything's okay. Like we have enough money that, there's no problem here. And then Sam Bankman-Fried said, did you consider our Korean friend, which was referring to this account that's called, it's under the username of like cyancharles@gmail.com or something like that. And they basically like moved Alameda's line of credit or their sort of negative balance to that account. It had something, the explanation that they gave was something around like to avoid them being charged interest on it when they shouldn't have been or something like that. But ultimately it sort of, some of the argument here is that it was sort of hiding some of this debt. And so the fact that that wasn't included in these charts, like totally misrepresents Alameda's financial position at that time, which seems pretty bad, especially given Gary Wong, who already testified saying that like, yeah, things looked great until we looked at this whole big account that had like billions of dollars in it or billions of dollars of liabilities. I am about to lose my voice. Okay. So, they also, there is this really long set of questions that I actually thought that maybe the prosecution went a little too far with this, where it was like, okay, we get it. But they were saying that like, you can't say that the queries that you ran were being used by SBF or any FTX employees. You don't know how these tables were used at FTX, right? You can't say that the tables you examined included all relevant data, right? You can't testify that this database doesn't hold crypto. Okay, wait, that was kind of a weird point. At one point they said something like, and it was like they were almost just asking like a clarifying question. They were like, the database you were examining, it doesn't hold crypto, right? Which is like this, we've seen that come up a couple of times where like the database doesn't actually have the money in it. It's just a ledger of the transactions, which I don't understand why they go into that, because I think it probably just confuses the jury. But it's like, right, the database is not the wallet that holds the crypto funds in the same way that the database is not the bank account that holds the US dollars. But the expert, I guess, the witness that they had called did not testify to that. He basically was like, I don't know if I can say that. Maybe maybe there's something I missed, or that I don't understand about this database, which I thought was like, yikes, man, you should know that. So that was kind of weird. And then, yeah, so they just really hammered this whole, like, you didn't do this, right? You didn't do this, right? Just to say that, like, you were just looking at this database and making conclusions based on this database. And then finally they go, okay, let's take a look at what you did do. At which point there was like laughter in the overflow room. He spoke about what he did do, which was basically add up all these accounts that looked like they were Alameda, excluding, unfortunately, these very important accounts. He seemed confused by the concept of a negative balance, which wasn't, I think, a great moment for the defense because the negative balance has been a key part of this case. And this guy basically was like, I don't really understand what that means. He was like, there's a line of credit and then there are assets, which you would expect to see in a balance column. And so having the balance cost column be negative doesn't really make any sense. Like, that's a weird way to represent a liability. And it was like, yikes, man, but like this guy, I mean, you can't blame him. He wasn't given access to anything besides the database and the code. And so he doesn't have any of the witness statements. He didn't interview any of the witnesses. He didn't talk to Sam Bankman-Fried. He hasn't been following the trial. He said at one point that he's seen some headlines, but then like who hasn't really? So I didn't think that was great. There was a point at which they got into some pretty detailed conversation about a portion of the code where there was a function that basically retrieved the line of credit in use, which was like for his first chart. And it had this sort of if statement that was like, if the user that you're trying to get the line of credit for is FTX, then also add these two additional accounts, which I believe were Cotton Grove Trading and FTX Ventures. The cross-examination, the prosecutors were basically trying to argue that like you should have had basically two charts, one that had the additional accounts included and one that didn't, and you don't have that. And so, who knows how that might have affected this outcome. We could see a totally different picture. And the witness tried to say that, his recollection was that it didn't have a material impact. It was, either zero or close to zero. But he did say that like he was hazy about that. So I think that introduced a little bit of doubt. And then, I think towards the end of the cross-examination, that was when they started to overdo it a little bit, where they were like really just hammering home all of the stuff that his analysis didn't cover, which like I get what they were trying to do. They were trying to say to the jury that like you were just looking at the data, you were not making any inferences about wrongdoing and blah, blah, blah. But like they went really hard on this to the point that the judge actually got kind of annoyed, again, about them like reading exhibits or just like, saying things that, you didn't do this, right? You didn't do this, right? Like a sort of endless list. At one point, the judge had this sort of outburst. So Judge Kaplan has a little bit of a temper, nothing, I think, outrageous, and he's kind of funny. And so when he loses his temper, it's pretty funny. And he made some analogy of like, when I was younger, when I was like a teenager and I was working in my dad's deli, if he told me to go into the back and add up, from the ledger, the amount of smoked fish that we sold, and I go to him and I give him my number and he starts asking me, does this include pastrami? No. Does this include macaroni salad? No. He's saying that like, what's in it. And so you don't have to ask everything that's not in it because what's in it. And so this is a pointless line of questioning because we can just assume that he did what he said he did and nothing else. And so he got kind of annoyed at that point. The final thing. Oh, there's two final things. So again, well, three. The Korean friend, Sayun Charles, was not included, which again I think is pretty unfortunate for the credibility of this witness and the charts and everything. There was one other thing, which was that obviously not all of these assets are denominated in US dollars. There's crypto, there's other fiat, and then obviously US dollars. And so, but these charts are all denominated in US dollars because it would be impossible to have just like a million charts for each different currency. And so the way that he calculated basically the dollar value of all these cryptos was by using the approximate fair value numbers that were stored in FTX's database. He did no analysis of the credibility of those numbers. He did not account for the fact that any of those numbers might have changed. There were obviously massive market fluctuations around the time of FTX's collapse. And so they did very successfully, I think, introduce some doubt into the credibility of those numbers, which I think is really important for stuff like FTT, which is the FTX exchange token. Am I really blurry all of a sudden? Maybe if I get closer. I'm such a pro live streamer. Anyway, so they, for stuff like FTT, which is like not very liquid, but which made up a huge part of FTX's balance sheet, if they were including this as though it was, at fair market value, even though there's no way they could ever sell that many tokens at anything close to fair market value, then like that could really throw off these charts. So I think that was a really important point. And then finally, they pushed back on the argument around spot margin lending, and futures activity, basically saying that like all they had was this one chart that lumped those all together. And there was no charts that showed just margin without the futures activity. And they were saying that basically these futures customers, the customers who were involved in futures trading, didn't agree to lend funds in the way that margin, people who had margin enabled had. And so therefore, we can't really evaluate those groups separately because you're just going off of what the defense told you to lump together. So I thought that was also kind of an important point. Let me just look at there is all right, let me just quickly close and then reopen. Yeah, that usually forces the camera to refocus. This was a defense witness, not the prosecution. Was it a 3D pie chart? It was unfortunately a boring 2D pie chart. Okay, so at this point, we get into the whole thing about Sam Bankman-Fried and why the jury was not there. So they got into this a little bit at the beginning of the day, and they weren't quite sure how they were going to handle it. They sort of decided they were going to take it as it comes. But basically, there's like, they couldn't come to an agreement on some of the defense, some of the questions that the defense wanted Sam Bankman-Fried to answer, like some of the stuff that they wanted Sam Bankman-Fried to testify about. And so at the beginning of the day, they had estimated that Sam Bankman-Fried's testimony would probably take, what was it? Where are my notes? Yeah, so they guessed that direct questioning of Sam Bankman-Fried would probably be 4 or 5 hours, but then there was these additional points that they said would take maybe 60 or 90 minutes that they needed to have the judge rule on, whether or not they could ask him these questions. And the judge basically said that he didn't have enough information to know whether or not it would be appropriate or not for Sam Bankman-Fried to testify on those topics. And so what he decided to do was just to have the jury leave, and then Sam Bankman-Fried would testify to everything, just the portions of things that were under dispute, at which point both sides of the prosecution and the defense would argue about why they should and should not be included, at which point the judge would make a ruling, and then the jury would come back and hear whichever portions, if any or all, the judge decided were permissible. And so originally it seemed like maybe the defense would start with all the stuff that didn't have those particular issues, and then tomorrow maybe they would do that hearing, and then who knows. And there's actually this concern for a minute that like they would start the direct today, and then tomorrow they would finish whatever was left, and then they would dismiss the jury and do this hearing, which would have meant that cross-examination would be pushed until Monday, which was terrible news for me because I am not planning to stay here until Monday. Like I said, I initially planned to come here Monday and Tuesday. I eventually decided I should be here Thursday, Friday, and I could stay through the weekend, but one, hotels last minute are fucking expensive. And also I had to sort of call in a favor with my dog sitter to watch my very needy dog, who honestly, he's got separation anxiety, but I think I have separation anxiety too. I miss him dearly. So anyway, I've been like praying all day that this would not go into Monday. And so after we got back from lunch, they finished the last defense witness who was not Sam Bankman-Fried. We got back from lunch, and then the judge said, "You know what we're going to do? We're going to dismiss the jury now, let him off, for the rest of the day." And at this point, Sam Bankman-Fried was sitting in the witness stand. He leaves the witness stand like he's not going to testify. They let the jury go. At this point, like probably a third of the people who were in the overflow room with me left, which turned out to be a bad decision. Because, oh boy, bear with me because, oh boy. Anyway, long story short on scheduling, it doesn't seem like my concerns have been vindicated, because it seems like he will, because we did this hearing today, that issue should be all sorted by tomorrow, at which point Sam Bankman-Fried will do direct questioning, which they've estimated will take 4 or 5 hours, I think. And then the cross-examination can begin. The cross-examination, they have estimated 45 minutes, which is insane to me. Like I said, the prosecutor is the Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Sassoon is very efficient. Sam Bankman-Fried is not. He is. I mean, you ask him a yes or no question, and it takes him 3 minutes to respond. So we'll see about that. I have my doubts, but I'm hoping at least that we will get all of the direct testimony tomorrow, and then the cross-examination will get, a good portion of it, and then maybe it'll spill into Monday, but I'm hoping that, I won't miss the bulk of it. So with that, let's get into what happened with Sam Bankman-Fried. Okay. So first of all, he took the stand. This was the first chance I actually got to see him since, I guess, the hearings pre-trial, when he would show up in court and they'd snap pictures of him coming and going. But like I mentioned before, no cameras in the courtroom, no laptops, nothing like that. And so all I have seen are the courtroom sketches, which are not flattering. And so I was not sure if what he looks like, because I heard he got a haircut, and I've never seen him in a suit, really. I mean, I guess, again, pre-trial, but he did get a haircut. The camera on the witness is not very good. The brightness, it's like really overexposed, and so he looks pale as shit, like totally ghostly white. I don't think that's a him thing. I think that's a camera thing, because I've seen the other witnesses there today, and it's just like totally overexposed. But he does have shorter hair. It's not like short, it's not like crew cut or something like that, but it's not, it used to be at some points it would sort of fluctuate, but it was big at some points. Now it's like sort of more closely cropped. It might be parted down the middle. Again, can't tell if that's just a camera thing. Weird if not. He had like a gray suit, just like a white shirt, and then he was wearing a tie. At first I thought he wasn't wearing a tie, because again, the camera was really blown out and it's a light color. And so I was like, did he really show up to testify without putting on a tie? Because that's crazy. But he was wearing a tie. And he sits down and he's in his seat, and it's a swivel chair. And he immediately starts doing this, just like for the first minute or so. And I was like, oh my God, he's going to fidget through this whole thing. But I think he must have gotten some coaching or something, because he did sort of rein that in at some point. He did it a couple times, but like it wasn't for the whole time, because I was like, oh God. Anyway, they start. So the defense is up first to ask him questions. And so they're the friendly people trying to just get him to give his side of the story and explain how this was all a big mistake, or, whatever they're going for. But to be clear, the part that we were doing today was scoped down only to really the portions that there had been dispute about. And so this was mostly pertaining to advice of counsel. So throughout this whole case, there's been this back and forth around Sam Bankman-Fried and deciding to put on an advice of counsel defense. And so if he was putting on like a formal advice of counsel defense, he would have to also bring out proof that like he had spoken to attorneys about all this stuff, that he had hired them in good faith, believing that they were, competent attorneys who were not giving him advice to break the law, that he had given them all the relevant information. So, if he had said like, all right, please draft this payments agreement to allow us to transfer funds between Alameda and FTX, like you would have to actually say that like, and also we're going to be spending those funds on venture capital investments or real estate in the Bahamas or whatever. And so there's this whole, hoops you have to jump through to put on one of those formal defenses. And the defense team has said repeatedly that they're not doing that. But it seems to me, at least, and again, not a lawyer, not an expert, this is my first trial. It seems to me like they're kind of just trying to sneak it in edgewise a little bit and say that like, they're trying to put in these loan agreements that he signed. They're trying to talk about these data retention policies pertaining to the signal auto deletion. They are trying to talk about, what was the other thing? The loans, and the FTX terms of service around whether or not they could lend funds. And so I think that's why there was this dispute, is basically the prosecution is like, you can't do that. You've said you're not bringing in a advice of counsel defense. The judge has sort of precluded you from doing so at this point because you are not doing that extra legwork that you would need to do if that was, going to be a major part of your defense. And so anyway, they had this whole hearing and almost all of it pertained to topics that Sam Bankman-Fried had or had not spoken to a lawyer about. And so it started with the topic of signal chats and data retention policies, which, boy, fascinating stuff. Data retention policies. And so first they started by talking about Slack and Signal and Telegram and all these different channels that they use. He immediately goes really into the weeds about, they ask him about encryption and what it means for a messaging app to be encrypted. And he immediately starts saying, well, today on the internet, everything's encrypted, like pretty much everyone uses HTTPS. And, he's going into the fact that like, yeah, sure, most web query, when you're transferring data over the web, yeah, it's encrypted. And he just like takes this total, like, it's like that, the meme with the car that just like goes off the exit, the off ramp, like he's going in a totally different direction that, again, so the jury was not here, but if they had been, like, they would have been asleep or lost or confused. Like, it was just, I was like, oh God, this is not going to go well. This is like the first response that he gives. And then he goes into Signal, which is end-to-end encrypted and what that means. And, it means that, there's some extra level of safety that you wouldn't necessarily get with Slack and blah, blah, blah. So he sort of brings it back, but he tries to say, he makes a couple of arguments around why they were using Signal. He says something about there were these constant hacking attempts on FTX. They were originally based in Hong Kong. And so there were these sort of political concerns around state pressure to try to get access to data. He had all these concerns about maybe former employees like going rogue and selling the data that they had or something, which, again, end-to-end encryption is not going to stop that. And also deletion policies are not going to stop that. Like, you can set your Signal chat to auto delete. Your rogue employee can just take a screenshot. Like, that's not really going to help. But anyway, I'm not the prosecutor. That would be fun though. They should take questions from the audience. So they get talking about this data retention policy, which he says was put together by Dan Friedberg and Fenwick and West. Quick sidebar here. Dan Friedberg was the general counsel of FTX US International, because it was Ryan Miller who was general counsel of FTX US. It's hard to tell to what extent he has been involved in this whole thing. He did make an appearance briefly earlier on in the FTX bankruptcy proceedings where he I don't know if he filed an amicus brief. It was something really weird. And there was a point at which there was a Zoom hearing for the bankruptcy proceedings, and he, like, popped up and, like, butted in, and the judge in the bankruptcy got really mad, and, like, it's this whole weird thing. A little background on Dan Friedberg. He's a lawyer, he's worked at fairly respectable, law firms, Fenwick& and West being the most recent. Before that, he was a lawyer at a place called Ultimate Bet, which was an online gambling outfit, online poker specifically. And if you've ever heard of Black Friday in online poker, they were involved. If you don't know what that is, there is a Crypto Critics Corner episode about Black Friday that you need to watch or listen to. I think this was before they were doing YouTube, like video. Anyway, it was a sort of meltdown in the online poker world where it turned out that this Ultimate Bet platform had what was called God mode, where some players could see the other player's hand and cheat. And so it was this whole fraud case. And he was there at that time. He was even implicated in some of this behavior, or maybe in a cover-up. I can't remember the details off the top of my head, but he was like there, and he was never charged. He never went to jail, nothing like that, but he certainly seems to have been aware of what was happening there. And so there were all these questions around, why did FTX hire this guy who seems like he was complicit, at least in another company that was doing fraud? Big question. Anyway, Dan Friedberg came up a lot today. Not clear to what extent he has participated or cooperated in any of this, although he's clearly given testimony at some point. I'm not really sure under what circumstances, but they did make some reference to that. But like, he's not been put on the stand, and I'm not sure if that's because they don't want to or because they can't get him. But that's the background on Dan Friedberg. So he was the general counsel. Keep that in mind. And then Fenwick & West is the firm that he was working at. He originally was brought on as a lawyer while he was working for Fenwick & West, and then they had him sort of, consulting from Fenwick & West, and then he left Fenwick & West to work for FTX, but they continued to also have additional outside counsel from Fenwick & West. And so at some points there were these documents where Dan Friedberg and also some other Fenwick & West guys did some of this stuff. And one of those documents was this document retention policy. And so this came out because they were getting, he called it constant regulatory inquiries, where different jurisdictions that FTX wanted to operate in would ask about their setup. And one of the things that they cared a lot about was that they had these, acceptable document retention policies. So FTX was like, oh shit, I guess we need one of those. And so they put it together, and it basically said, these are the circumstances in which you do need to retain data for some period of time, even indefinitely. And then these are the situations in which case you need to not retain data. And that was mostly around like social security numbers and passport copies and like KYC stuff, know your customer. Was like, you need to get rid of that within a time frame. It's just too dangerous to keep around. But like, by and large, there was not a requirement to delete communications. There were some requirements about communications that needed to be retained. That was mostly to do with compliance stuff, legal stuff, and then sort of what he kept referring to formal business documents. And it became very clear that he had a very different definition of that than the prosecutors. They went into the topic of this data retention policy. Sorry if I'm like rambling. I know this has been an hour already, but it was a long day. Excuse me. So data retention policy, he discussed this with Dan Friedberg, and then ultimately it was implemented. There were all these questions around like, how much did he read it? How much did he talk about it with Dan Friedberg? Blah, blah, blah. And then they start talking about his Signal auto deletion. And they show that, eventually at some point he turned on this setting where his Signal messages would auto delete after about a week. That was like the default. And then they show what I actually thought they should have gone into more, the defense. They go back to the exhibits from this morning from the government the government's last witness that show all of these chats where Sam Bankman-Fried had enabled auto deletion, and a lot of them, it also shows that he disabled auto deletion on, I think it was November 9th, which was again right around the time that this whole bankruptcy thing was going down. And I felt like there was an argument to be made there that, like, oh my God, he knew things were going wrong. He wanted to make sure that all this stuff was preserved so that, look how honest he was. He wanted to make sure we all got access, all this stuff. They never really made that argument. And maybe there's a reason why, like, maybe there's something that they would have come up against in cross-examination that I don't know about. But, like, that seemed like a kind of an obvious win that they never really went into. Excuse me. As you can probably hear, I immediately start to lose my voice after it's like an hour and I just lose my voice. So anyway, he turns off auto delete. They sort of touch on it, but they don't go into it nearly to the extent that I expected. Okay, so they're getting to the end of this questioning about the document retention policy, and they get into the specific topic about this one chat that was called privileged/confidential CFTC. And this is something that the defense brought up, and I have no idea where they were going with this. Eventually, they mention that it was Gary Wong who turned off the auto deletion, and it was after the collapse. Like, Sam Bankman-Fried had missed it. He said at some point that, like, when things were going down, he went through all the signal chats he could think of to turn off auto deletion. But, he had hundreds of them. And so it was really just like the most recent ones or the ones that had activity that he got to. And so maybe he missed one or whatever. But it was Gary Wong who turned off the auto deletion in that chat. And they ask like one or two questions about that. And then the defense team says, okay, let's move on to another topic. And the judge is like, hang on, wait a minute. And he asked him a question about it. Basically, like, he asked him sort of the obvious question, which is like, why didn't you turn that off? And Sam Bankman-Fried, this is the first question he got from someone who is not his defense team. He immediately seemed shaken. And I was like, oh no, like, this does not bode well. And he gave this sort of meandering, halting answer to that. The defense says they're going to move on. The judge says, one thought that readily occurs, where is this policy, this document retention policy? And there's like 10 seconds of silence. I don't know if Sam Bankman-Fried was supposed to answer that question or if it was his defense team that was supposed to answer that question. No one answered that question. And the judge goes, let's move on. So we'll come back to that a little bit. But long story short, they do not have a copy of this document retention policy that they keep referring to. And so every time that Sam Bankman-Fried says something around what this document says or doesn't say, first of all, he caveats it like at length about how this is all his memory, but he doesn't have a document that he can look at. And there's no way to, like, he could make it up and you wouldn't know. And so we'll come back to that in a minute, but kind of crazy. So they move on. Let me just quickly look at the chat. I'm going to go find my other water bottle. 1 second. We're back. I also have an Advil because I have a headache. One thing I forgot to mention, this is not something I would have done if I thought that Sam Bankman-Fried was going to testify when he did, but I got my flu and my COVID shots on Tuesday morning, I think. And it does not always go well for me. So like Tuesday night, I was feeling a little crummy, woke up Wednesday with a headache, and by Wednesday night, I was on a plane. Luckily, I have not had much in the way of side effects. I've had a couple of times where like they totally knocked me out, but I do have this sort of like lingering headache. Anyway, not to worry. Back to the chat. So don't worry about me losing my voice. It comes back like immediately when I stop talking. Why am I awake? It is 7:30. It's not that late. I might so there's some question around whether or not I want to try to wake up at the crack of dawn tomorrow. And actually, no, it's not the crack of dawn. It would be like 2 in the morning because that's when you apparently need to line up to get into the courtroom. I'm trying to decide if I want to do that tomorrow. Um, I started the day thinking I super did because like you don't see the jury when you're in the overflow room. You can't see anyone in the audience. You can't see Sam Bankman-Fried's parents. You can't really see the defense or the prosecution team that well. And so I was like, oh, there's so much I'll miss if I'm in this overflow room with this tiny little stream, but it's actually not that bad. The audio is super clear. Um, I spoke to some people who were in the courtroom today who said that they didn't feel like they got that much out of seeing the jury, but critically, the jury was not there for Sam Bankman-Fried's testimony. And so, like, it may be that I really should be there tomorrow to try to see that. So I'm still good. We'll see. I might try to wake up at the butt crack of dawn or really in the middle of the night to try to go see that. So I'll try to get an early night one way or the other, but it's 7:30. It's not super late. I'll be fine. All right. I need like a lozenge. Sorry if that was really loud, me clearing my throat into my mic. I forgot it was right there. Oakley dokley. Good law podcast where they discuss queuing for trials. I don't know which law podcast you're referring to. Please let me know because I am apparently a huge law nerd now. But I love the Serious Trouble podcast, which is for those of you Twitter denizens, it's hosted by Ken White, who's perhaps better known on Twitter as Popat. I did actually an interview with him earlier in the Sam Bankman-Fried trial when it was like shortly after. I think it was shortly after Sam Bankman-Fried leaked Caroline Ellison's. No, it was shortly after Sam Bankman-Fried was caught basically tampering with a witness, and it was when he had not. The judge was like, "No, seriously, this is your final warning," but he had not put him back in prison. No, that's not right. It was when. Sorry, I'm so fried. It was when Sam Bankman-Fried got out on bond, and it's like, why is he out on bond? How does that even work? Anyway, I did an interview with him. It was super fun. Super cool to talk to him. He's so knowledgeable and so generous with his time to share that with me. And he periodically checks in on the SBF case throughout his reporting. He mostly, especially with all the Trump stuff that's going on, he mostly covers that, but he will occasionally give some insight into the Sam Bankman-Fried trial that is like always so valuable. Like he talked a little bit about the whole Adderall thing. There's been this issue where Sam Bankman-Fried he wasn't getting access to the Adderall that he needed, and then during trial there's been an issue where he's on like the immediate release version of Adderall, and he's supposed to get it 4 times a day. But the Bureau of Prisons is super strict about who they will allow to give it to him. And sorry if you can hear people in the hallway. I hope I'm not like annoying my neighbors by talking. It's 7:30. Anyway, yeah, they're super strict about that. And so he was only getting his Adderall like first thing in the morning when he was leaving the jail, which would wear off by the time that he met with his defense team. And then he would get it like right when he got back to jail, which was often like 9:00 at night. And then he'd be all like cranked up at nighttime. But like during the trial, he didn't have his Adderall. And so they were like, he can't focus. He's trying to decide if he's going to testify. And he's not in this good, he doesn't have the adequate focus that he needs. So they were trying to get him put on extended release Adderall, which he has gotten. He has access to it. He has since last week before last, I think. So he's all good on that front, which I think is good. I think it's important that he gets medical care that he needs. Like if the prison doesn't want to give him his Adderall, they need to actually make some argument as to why he shouldn't get it. There was something that was brought up by the prosecution around, like, the Bureau of Prisons did question whether or not he really needs this dosage, and there has been all this speculation around the physician who prescribed it, who was apparently fairly, uh, lax about who he would give these prescriptions to, but, like, anyway, they should actually go through things and not just be like, "Sorry, sucks to suck." So anyway, but, Popat gave in serious trouble. They talked about that a little bit, and critically, they talked about whether or not that's likely to be an appellate issue. I always say appellate. Um, so, and it seemed like in his much more experienced opinion that it's not likely to be a successful basis for appeal that he's not getting his Adderall. Anyway, let's go back to what he was saying on the stand. Okay, so next topic, North Dimension. Oh, one moment. Please autofocus. Why is it like this? Come on. This is what you guys all come here for. The fuck? All right. Well, this may be as good as it's gonna get. I even brought my, like, slightly better webcam. Maybe it's because my fuck it, whatever. I think it's because my hand is in front of it. Does anyone have any ways to fix this? All right, I'm just gonna keep talking. North Dimension is a entity that was set up. So things all started out. Oh, I guess I could unplug